Good morning, friends. One of the most difficult things about God being sovereign, about God being in absolute control, is that due to our baseline sinful nature as human beings, we want to be in control. That was the fundamental motivation for Adam and Eve falling to temptation in the Garden of Eden, that they could be like God if they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they could be their own lawmakers, abide by their own rules, live according to their own standards, and not have to submit, supposedly, after that, to the restrictions of the actual God. But here's the thing. We are not God. For one true God, the one true God, remains the one true God. And he alone is sovereign and in absolute control. And as much as our sinful natures rebel against that notion, even as Christians, we have to tame and bind that sinful nature and bring it into conformity to the truth. For as much as we may struggle with the idea of God being sovereign, we need God to be sovereign. The only way we can actually have peace in this life is for God to be in complete control. And again, when I say in complete control, I mean in complete control. R.C. Sproul used to say that there is not a single rogue molecule in all the universe that has broken free from God's sovereignty. Because if there were, who knows what kind of chain reaction of unanticipated chaos that rogue molecule might be able to cause. What monkey wrenches might be able to be thrown into God's carefully crafted plan, messing everything up. Because that's what it comes down to. Throughout the scriptures, God reveals himself as the one who ordains all things, sets all things in motion, sustains all things, moves all things to the properly established conclusion that will bring him the greatest glory and bring the greatest good to his people. But how could he do that? How could he make promises guaranteeing anything? Well, how could he do that at all if he wasn't in absolute control? Take the classic promise of Romans 8:28. How could God cause all things to happen for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose if he was not in control? If he were not sovereign, this promise is anything but guaranteed. He might be able to pull it off for most of the time or even the vast majority of the time, but if God were not in control of all things, then there is no way he could guarantee this promise to each and every one of his children. And we can settle into the peace given us by the knowledge of the sovereignty of God because of these logical arguments well enough. And I would encourage you to do just that. But we also have God's self-revelation, the scriptures, that not only gets us to God's sovereignty and therefore the peace we can have in him. Not only does it get us there by logical deduction, but there are so many scripture passages that point directly to it. Consider the following simple statements. First, from Psalm 115, verse 3, we read, "Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases." Or Isaiah 46:10, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, "My counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose." Of course, that was God speaking himself. Proverbs 19:21, "Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." Psalm 135:6, "Whatever the Lord pleases, he does in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all deeps." Psalm 103:19, "The Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all." And two more, though there are many, many more that we could keep on going to. We have Job 42:2, where Job is speaking to God himself, and he says, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." And then lastly, Isaiah 43:13, again, God speaking directly, saying, "There is none who can deliver from my hand. I work, and who can turn it back?" The idea, of course, being who can stand against what I do? Who can block me from doing what I want to do? Who can nullify my power and stop me? And of course, the answer is absolutely no one. And friends, brothers, sisters, this ought to be one of the greatest comforts for us. It demonstrates God's awesomeness and his goodness to be able to be in control, to be able to keep his promises. And some people disagree on this. Let me address that briefly here. I talked quite recently to a pastor who said that God's sovereignty was all well and good as far as it went, but that really his most important attribute is his love. And the implication was, and this is an argument I've heard on many other occasions, with the idea that the more emphasis we place on God's sovereignty, it's like somehow that diminishes his love. As if we focus more on God's being in control, then by default, he must be made out to be a tyrant of some sort. But that's not the case at all. Because it is only in his sovereignty that he can be loving toward us. Again, the core promise of Romans 8:28 is that God promises to do good to all who love him and are called according to his purpose because he chose to love them first. That promise is one of the greatest expressions of God's law. And I don't think anyone would disagree with that promise being one of the greatest expressions of his love. And yet he couldn't make that promise if he wasn't sovereign, if he wasn't in absolute control. So we would not truly be able to experience God's love if it weren't for his sovereignty. I mean, just think about everything we talked about on Sunday in terms of what Christ was going to go through to bring us redemption, to redeem a people for himself, for their good and for his glory, and how he was in control of all of those circumstances so that it would happen. He couldn't, the cross, the death and resurrection of Christ, which is the absolute greatest expression of God's love for his people and for himself, could not have taken place if it wasn't for his sovereign control. Now, does this bring up questions for us that are difficult, that are hard for us to deal with sometimes about God's sovereignty and man's responsibility? How about God's sovereignty and the fact that bad things happen in the world? The whole problem of evil thing. Yes, there are questions. And I've addressed many of these questions already at various times in these devotions, and I'm likely to do so again in the future. And while I don't have time to get into all of them right now, I can say these two things. First, there are answers to those questions. And second, please consider this, especially regarding the idea of how can God be sovereign in this way, in this absolute control way, and yet there still be evil in the world. Okay, that's a big question. I want to admit that. I want to throw that over. That's a big question. Well, if we try to get God off the hook, for the evil in the world, is by saying, well, it's not God's fault. He's not responsible in any way for any of it. So we try to avoid the hard questions of why God would allow these bad things to happen. Well, the only way we can do that is by concluding that God isn't actually powerful enough to do anything about it. Therefore, that he's not sovereign. The only reason bad things happen, according to this line of thinking, is that God is actually not in control. And so he's simply doing his best. But, he can't be everywhere. He can't keep track of everything. Cut him some slack, right? And I apologize, I really do, if anyone thinks I'm making fun of that view. But my purpose is not to make fun of it. It's just that's what it comes down to. If God is not sovereign, then that's why there's evil in the world, because he just can't get to it all. He doesn't have the capacity to stop the evil from happening. So if we try to get God off the hook, so that we can't point any fingers at God concerning the things we don't like in the world, the only way we can do so is to diminish the power of God. He can no longer be an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-wise God. But friends, here's the bottom line, though, if we try to go that direction. If he's not those things, then he's not God. At best, that reduces him to the level of the humanized gods of the Greek and Roman pantheons, the kind of gods that were just sort of exalted human beings, super powerful human beings who ultimately make a mess of things due to their lack of ultimate power, due to their lack of sovereignty. Those various gods and goddesses created by so many various sinful human cultures. But friends, God is not like those lesser false gods. He is the God of the heavens and the earth, the Almighty, the eternal God, and he is sovereign. Which is why you can trust him to keep all those promises that he has made to his children, to all who call on his name. That's why there is peace in the Christian life, because we trust him as the sovereign God. It is true. He is sovereign. He is in control. He will not put anyone who calls on his name to shame. And that's a promise. But that wouldn't be a promise he could not keep if he was not in control. Think on these things, friends, and be comforted to know who God is and take peace in his sovereign will, for it is good and pleasing and perfect. Have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.